The Orion-X space station floated silently in the vast void of space, far from any visible stars, orbiting a dark planet at the edge of a forgotten galaxy. The environment inside the station was undisturbed, except for the constant hum of the ventilation systems and the intermittent flickers of monitoring panels. The mission was simple: to study gravitational anomalies around the unknown planet. Captain Rios gave the final instructions to the crew before the study began. The rest of the team consisted of lead scientist Dr. Helena Castro, engineer Daniel Klein, communications specialist Priya Sharma, and physicist Marco Alvarez. It was a routine mission. The astronauts were far from home, but they knew there was nothing but emptiness surrounding them. The objective was straightforward, but the isolation began to take its toll. Days dragged on as the crew maintained the equipment and collected data, but there was something peculiar about this place. The planet ahead, shrouded in dark clouds with a surface scarred by craters, seemed to pull the station into a strange sense of discomfort. With each passing day, an invisible cloud of unease grew thicker. On the fourth day, Priya, the communications specialist, detected an anomaly in the sky. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice trembling. The light from the local sun, a weak and unstable star, began to fade. What initially seemed like a normal phenomenon quickly turned into an eclipse. The crew watched from the station's window as the eclipse stretched longer than expected. Time itself seemed to slow down as the light dimmed, but the strangest part was that the eclipse wasn't behaving like any natural one. It was as though the sun was holding the light back, absorbing it slowly, with no intention of returning. As the darkness deepened, Captain Rios sent a communication to Earth's command center, awaiting a response, but the communication was oddly unstable. What had once been brief moments of interference was now a continuous disruption. The station felt more distant from the world they knew. "I think we need to investigate the source of this," Helena said, her eyes scanning the screen. "This isn't right." As the astronauts tried to adjust their instruments to study the anomaly's origin, an odd sound began to infiltrate the station's audio systems. It was a whisper. A soft, unintelligible voice that mingled with the static of the communications. Engineer Klein glanced at his communication monitor, and his face contorted in confusion. He couldn't identify the source of the sound, but something in his mind told him the voice was calling someone. And then, it happened. He heard his own name. It was brief, just a fleeting moment. But it was enough to send a ripple of tension through the crew. They weren't alone. As the days passed, the eclipse showed no signs of ending. What had initially seemed like a temporary anomaly quickly revealed itself to be something far more unsettling. The Orion-X crew continued their research, trying to understand the nature of the eclipse. But the more they observed, the less it made sense. The sun, the source of all their light, remained cloaked in darkness, as if it had been swallowed by an invisible force. The darkness seemed to stretch beyond the physical boundaries of the station, seeping into every crevice, every system, and every mind. It was unnatural, something that shouldn't be happening in the known laws of physics. Dr. Helena Castro was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "This isn't just an eclipse," she muttered, staring at the data on her screen. "This isn't natural. It's like something is holding the sun hostage." The crew gathered in the station's main command room, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had already tried everything to make sense of what was happening. They had checked their instruments repeatedly. The station's communication system, which had been experiencing strange interference since the eclipse began, was now completely unreliable. Attempts to contact Earth had failed, the signals barely reaching past the edge of the station's orbit. Something was distorting their connection, just as the eclipse was distorting the light. Engineer Daniel Klein had been working on a theory. He theorized that a gravitational anomaly in the planet's orbit could be causing the eclipse to last far longer than it should. But as he reviewed the data, he couldn't shake the feeling that the cause was something more insidious. "The planet's gravity isn't the problem," he said quietly, his voice laced with frustration. "It's something else. Something not of this world." Priya Sharma, the communications expert, had been picking up something strange in the audio systems. The whispers were getting louder, more persistent. At first, they were soft murmurs, almost imperceptible. But now, they were becoming clear, distinguishable voices. It wasn't static or interference anymore. There were words. And those words were calling them by name. "I'm hearing it again," Priya said, her hands trembling as she adjusted the station's audio system. "It's getting clearer. It's saying," she stopped abruptly, her face frozen in terror. The voice wasn't just calling their names, it was speaking things only they knew, things no one else could possibly understand. The voice called out to each of them individually, whispering secrets from their pasts, fears they had buried deep inside. Daniel, unnerved, tried to reach out to Priya. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "It knows everything," she whispered, almost in a trance. "It knows things that no one should know." Panic set in as the crew realized the true horror of their situation. The eclipse wasn't just some cosmic anomaly, it was a signal, a calling. Something beyond their comprehension was trying to communicate with them, to manipulate their minds, to invade their reality. And that something was not of this world. Captain Rios paced the command room, his eyes darting between the screens. The station, once a symbol of human achievement, now felt like a tomb, isolated and alone in the vast emptiness of space. "We need to figure out what's causing this," he said with urgency. "We need to find out what's behind this eclipse. Whatever it is, it's not just playing with us, it's toying with our very perception of reality." As the crew scrambled to find answers, they began to notice other strange occurrences. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Lights flickered and died. The station's artificial gravity system became erratic. Objects shifted out of place as if moved by an unseen force. They had seen some of the darker aspects of space, but this was something entirely different. This wasn't just the cold, uncaring void of space, they were dealing with something alive, something that had the power to distort the very fabric of their reality. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the whispers changed. They stopped calling their names. Instead, they began to speak in a language none of them could understand. It wasn't a language of humans, nor was it any known form of communication. The words seemed to vibrate in the air, distorting the very fabric of sound itself. It was as if the station was now fully immersed in the presence of something far beyond their understanding, an entity that existed beyond the boundaries of time and space. At that moment, each member of the crew felt it, the unmistakable feeling that they were being watched. They were no longer alone. The Orion-X was no longer just a scientific vessel. It had become the stage for something much darker, something ancient, something that existed in the shadows of the universe. And it was coming for them. The whispering voices grew louder, now a constant presence that reverberated throughout the walls of the Orion-X. What had started as a strange anomaly had transformed into something far more terrifying. The crew could no longer deny it, they were not alone in the vast emptiness of space. An entity, something that defied all human comprehension, was invading their reality. The boundaries of the station were no longer secure, and every corner seemed to hide an unimaginable force. Dr. Helena Castro spent long hours poring over the data, trying to find a logical explanation, but there was none. Her scientific mind, once anchored in the principles of physics and reason, was now shaken. The anomaly they had been studying wasn't simply a gravitational disturbance, it was a presence, a force that was bending the very laws of time and space. "We're dealing with something beyond anything we've encountered," she whispered to herself, her hands shaking as she typed into the console. Captain Rios stood at the command center, his expression grave. The crew's initial attempts to contact Earth had failed, and now the communication systems were all but useless. "The longer this eclipse lasts, the more I'm convinced that this isn't just an astronomical event," he said to his team. "There's something else behind this. Something projecting the darkness. Something we can't see." The temperature inside the station began to fluctuate erratically, as if the very air was being manipulated. Klein, the engineer, kept checking the station's power systems, but every time he thought he had restored them, they would fail again. "It's like the station itself is alive," he muttered, his eyes scanning the flickering screens. Priya's hands trembled as she sat at the communications panel, trying to make sense of the voices she had been hearing. They were growing clearer, no longer just whispers, but distinct, deliberate words. Each voice was unique, some angry, others pleading, all of them calling out for something. She knew that they were speaking to her and the rest of the crew, each member individually. "It's getting worse," she said, her voice low. "They're speaking to us in ways we can't understand. It's like they're inside our heads." Then, the true nature of the entity began to reveal itself. One night, as the crew huddled together in the control room, the air suddenly grew unnaturally cold. A deep hum resonated through the walls, vibrating through the floor. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the station into an eerie darkness. For a moment, there was only the sound of their breathing, quick and shallow. Then, from the depths of the silence, a voice emerged, one they all recognized. "Helena," it called softly, as if whispering in her ear. "Do you remember the lake? The one from your childhood? The place where you almost drowned?" Helena's face drained of color as the voice lingered, repeating details of a memory long buried in her past. The voice knew her darkest fears, her most intimate memories, things only she could know. She felt the weight of it, the deep, suffocating pressure. The room was suffocating, but it wasn't the air, it was the presence of something that shouldn't be there. Then it was Marco's turn. "Marco," the voice said, cold and deliberate, "do you remember the moment you lost your sister? The day she vanished into the woods?" Marco's hand shot to his mouth as if he could suppress the voice from reaching him. His eyes filled with terror, and for a moment, he froze, his thoughts caught in the net of the entity's words. This was no random haunting. This was something actively manipulating them, forcing them to confront their deepest fears. The voice shifted to Daniel. "Daniel," it whispered, "your father never really loved you, did he? He just wanted you to be something you're not." Priya's face twisted with dread as she clutched the edge of the desk. She was about to speak when the voice cut her off. "Priya," it said, "do you remember your first day on the station? When you saw your mother's reflection in the window? She's still watching you." Priya screamed, slamming her hands down on the controls as her mind reeled from the onslaught of memories, some of which she had never told anyone, not even herself. They were not alone. The station itself was a conduit, a vessel for the entity's influence. The darkness was not merely an eclipse, it was a projection of this being, this ancient cosmic force that thrived in the voids between stars. It was a presence that existed outside of time, outside of human understanding, and it was feeding on their fear, using their own memories and doubts against them. The crew was trapped, caught in the web of the entity's influence. The more they resisted, the more the shadows seemed to close in on them. And then, in a chilling moment of clarity, Captain Rios realized the truth. The entity wasn't just haunting their minds, it was feeding on them. It was slowly pulling them into the darkness, erasing them from reality, one by one. The more they fought, the deeper they sank into the entity's grip. But even as the terror escalated, the crew refused to give in. They needed to understand what was behind this malevolent force and, if possible, stop it. But with each passing hour, their resolve weakened. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, an enemy that had no shape, no form. All they had was the darkness, the whispers, and the feeling that they were no longer in control of their own fate. And still, the eclipse stretched on. The shadows outside the station's windows seemed to grow thicker with each passing hour. The crew no longer spoke much, save for whispered words of fear or urgent instructions. The eclipse had now been going on for what felt like an eternity, and the entity's influence had deepened. Time itself seemed to have lost its meaning. The station's clocks ticked erratically, sometimes speeding up, other times pausing entirely, as if the very concept of time was being manipulated by the force that had taken hold of them. They had become prisoners, not just of the station, but of the darkness itself. Captain Isaac Rios stood by the observation window, his face drawn with exhaustion. His eyes, which once gleamed with confidence, were now clouded with a mixture of dread and determination. The crew had become fractured, each person was now consumed by their own personal horrors, dragged into the suffocating grip of the entity. It was almost as if the darkness was feeding on their vulnerabilities, their very souls. But Rios refused to let the fear take him completely. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. He had to keep his team alive. "I don't know how much longer we can last," Helena said, her voice breaking the silence. She sat hunched over a control panel, staring at the fluctuating readings that had become more erratic as the eclipse dragged on. "Our systems are failing one by one. Communications are still down, and we've lost most of our auxiliary power." Priya, who had been sitting in a corner, shivering uncontrollably, stood up suddenly. "It's not just the systems. The ship, the whole station is changing," she said in a low voice, her eyes wide with terror. "It's like the walls are alive. I can hear them moving." Her words hung in the air, chilling everyone to their core. The Orion-X had always been a marvel of human engineering, a solid fortress in the vast emptiness of space. But now, it felt like a fragile shell, like something that could crack open at any moment. The hum of the station's failing systems had taken on an eerie tone, as if the ship itself was moaning in pain. Daniel Klein had spent hours trying to restore the station's failing systems, but his efforts were in vain. "I can't fix this," he muttered, his hands trembling as he worked at a control panel. "It's like something sabotaging us from the inside." The station's walls groaned again, and the flickering lights briefly cast long, unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, forming dark shapes that almost seemed to move. Marco, who had been silent for a while, suddenly bolted upright. "Did you see that?" he gasped, pointing at the corner of the room. "There's something there. Something in the shadows." The crew turned to follow his gaze, but saw nothing. The shadows seemed still and normal once more, but the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded, was growing stronger. Every creak of the station, every flicker of light, made them jump. They were becoming paranoid, unable to trust their own senses. The voices in their heads had stopped, but the presence of the entity was still palpable, lingering in the air like a thick fog. It was as if the darkness had consumed the very essence of the station, turning it into a prison of their own fear. "We have to do something," Rios said, his voice a mixture of resolve and desperation. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to pick us off one by one." Helena's eyes widened in realization. "Wait? It's not just taking us. It's taking the station too. It's using the darkness to warp reality, pulling the station into its domain." "Exactly," Rios said, turning to the rest of the crew. "This thing, it's not just attacking our minds. It's rewriting everything. The eclipse, the shadows, those aren't natural. They're projections, distortions made by this thing. And if we don't stop it, the Orion-X, it'll cease to exist. We'll cease to exist." The crew exchanged worried glances, but there was a flicker of hope in Rios' words. If they could understand what the entity was doing, how it was manipulating reality, they might be able to find a way to stop it. At that moment, the station's systems went completely dark. The lights went out, and the low hum of the station's power systems fell silent. The crew members were plunged into complete darkness, their breath quickening in panic. The silence was broken by a low, vibrating sound, a hum that felt like it was coming from deep within the station's core. It was almost like the station itself was alive, breathing. "What's happening?" Priya whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive darkness. The station groaned again, this time louder, the vibrations rattling through the walls. It was then that they realized they weren't alone. The entity had fully entered the station. Its presence was no longer confined to the shadows. It was inside the very walls of the Orion-X, bending reality with its dark influence. The crew had no choice but to act. There was no more time for analysis, no more time for hesitation. If they didn't fight back now, they would be swallowed whole by the void. The entity, powerful and incomprehensible, had broken through their defenses, and now it was their turn to fight for survival. Rios moved quickly, gathering the crew together. "We fight, or we die. We'll have to use everything we've got left." But as he looked at each of their faces, the one thing that stood out was fear. The entity had made them question everything. Each one of them had been stripped of their certainty, their confidence. Now they faced an enemy they couldn't see, hear, or fully understand. And with the station systems in complete disarray, there was little left to rely on but each other. As the hum of the entity grew louder, a cold chill filled the room. The walls closed in, and Rios felt the overwhelming weight of the darkness pressing against him. The final test of survival had begun. Would they escape this endless nightmare, or would they be lost to the infinite void? The hum of the station, once a familiar and comforting sound, had become a constant reminder of their growing terror. The Orion-X was no longer a place of exploration or science. It had turned into a cage, a vessel of nightmares. The crew members huddled together in the control room, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with fear. They had already seen things that defied explanation, things that no human mind should ever comprehend. And yet, the worst was still to come. Rios stood at the head of the room, his eyes scanning the frightened faces of his crew. They had no clear plan, no immediate solutions. They were trapped in a place where logic no longer applied, where every step they took seemed to lead them further into the clutches of the entity. The hum from the depths of the station was growing louder, vibrating through the walls, as if something massive was moving beneath their feet. "We need to stick together," Rios said, his voice steady despite the panic bubbling just below the surface. "Whatever happens, we don't split up. Not now." Helena nodded, but her face showed no signs of confidence. She was a scientist, a problem solver, but here, in the face of the unknown, there were no equations to solve, no data to analyze that could offer them a way out. They were up against something beyond comprehension. "We don't even know what this thing is," she muttered. "We don't even know if it can be stopped." Daniel Klein, the engineer, was still trying to make sense of the station's systems. Every time he thought he had found the source of the disturbances, it would slip away, as if the entity itself was actively interfering. "I'm trying, but it's like the entire station is being manipulated. Every system is being hijacked, one after another. It's like it's adapting to us." Suddenly, the lights flickered again, plunging them back into darkness. A low, rumbling growl echoed from deep within the station, the source impossible to pinpoint. It was as though the very walls of the Orion-X had come alive, groaning in pain, suffocating them with an invisible weight. Priya, sitting in the corner, looked up with wide eyes, her hands clenched tightly around her chair. "I can hear it again," she said, her voice trembling. "The voices. They're in my head again. But this time, they're telling me to go somewhere. Telling me to go to the core of the station." Rio's heart sank. The core. If the entity was truly controlling the station, then it was likely the source of its power, the epicenter of its influence. They had to stop it there, but getting to the core was no simple task. The Orion-X was a vast, complex station, and navigating its labyrinthine halls had become increasingly dangerous. Every step forward seemed like a step deeper into the entity's lair. "We can't go alone," Rios said firmly, looking around at his crew. "We go together, or not at all. If this is where it's coming from, then we need to cut it off. This ends now." But as they prepared to move, something shifted. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the very station was pushing back against them. And then, from the corner of the room, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, reaching toward them like dark tendrils. The crew jumped back, instinctively pulling away, but the shadows followed them, creeping along the walls like an inescapable force. "It's here," Marco whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's in the room with us." Suddenly, the darkness pulsed with a deep, resonant sound. The entity was no longer just a whisper in their minds or a presence in the shadows. It was fully manifested, bending the very fabric of reality itself. The walls rippled, as if made of liquid darkness, and the crew felt the weight of something vast and incomprehensible pressing against their minds. The shadows shifted again, and then, there was a figure, a silhouette, standing at the far end of the room. It was tall, elongated, its form indistinct, as though it was made of the very darkness that surrounded them. It did not speak, but its presence filled the room, suffocating them with an overwhelming sense of dread. It's like a nightmare," Priya gasped, her voice trembling. "It's inside me. I can feel it, pulling at my thoughts." The figure began to move toward them, its shape flickering in and out of reality, shifting like smoke. It was an entity of pure darkness, its form defying the laws of physics, existing somewhere between the material world and something far older, far more sinister. "Run!" Rios shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. The crew didn't hesitate. They sprinted for the door, but as they reached it, the shadows seemed to close in, blocking their path. They were trapped. The station was alive with the entity's will, and there was nowhere to hide. "Get to the core!" Rios ordered, pushing the crew toward the hall. But they were fighting more than just an alien force. They were fighting their own fears, their own memories, as the entity began to play with their minds again. The darkness was not just a physical force, it was a manifestation of everything they had ever feared. Each step they took was an act of defiance against the overwhelming terror that gripped them. The entity was trying to break them, to use their weaknesses against them. "I won't. "I won't give in," Marco said, his voice shaking but determined. "We can still fight it." But even as they made their way down the hall toward the core, they could feel the pull of the entity growing stronger. It was watching them, waiting for them to falter. And with every passing moment, they were losing themselves. Rios took a deep breath, his mind racing with strategies. They had to get to the core. It was their only chance. They couldn't allow the entity to consume the station, to consume them. Not without a fight. They were nearing the entrance to the core, but the shadows were closing in, stretching longer and more aggressive. They had reached the heart of the station. And now, they would face whatever awaited them there. The station seemed to pulse in time with their racing hearts as they neared the entrance to the core. The oppressive darkness was closing in, tightening around them like a vice. The walls of the Orion-X groaned with an otherworldly sound, as though the very structure was being torn apart by some unseen force. Every step they took toward the core felt heavier, as if the station itself was fighting them, trying to stop them from reaching the center of the nightmare. Rios led the crew, his face set with grim determination. He could feel the pull of the entity, the weight of its presence growing stronger with every passing second. It wasn't just a physical threat anymore, it had become a force that was warping their very perceptions of reality. The walls seemed to close in, then stretch outward, distorting their sense of space. Time itself felt like it was slipping through their fingers, and the very air seemed thick with something ancient, something that didn't belong. Helena stumbled, her breath ragged as she tried to keep up. It's everywhere," she muttered, her eyes darting nervously around the corridor. "I can feel it in my mind again. It's trying to get inside of me." "We're almost there," Rios said, his voice low but firm. "Stay focused." The doors to the core loomed ahead, their dark, metallic surface reflecting the dim light of their flashlights. The shadows danced in the corners of their vision, and the low hum of the station grew louder, resonating deep within their bones. It was as though the Orion-X itself was alive, an entity in its own right, pulsing with the dark energy that had taken root in its systems. "Just a little further," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was leading the way, fingers trembling as he worked to override the security systems that had locked them out of the core. The lock released with a loud clunk, and the massive doors slid open with an eerie screech, revealing the dark heart of the station. Inside the core, the temperature had dropped dramatically, and the walls were lined with strange, alien symbols, glowing faintly in the dark, pulsing with an unnatural energy. The room itself was enormous, an almost cavernous space filled with twisting conduits and machines that seemed to hum with dark power. But it was not the machines that drew their attention, it was what stood at the center of the room. The entity. It stood in the center, a mass of shifting darkness, its form constantly changing. At times, it appeared humanoid, tall, shadowy, and thin, but at other moments, its shape seemed to ripple and distort, stretching out like liquid smoke. It was not solid, not physical, but something far more ancient, far more terrifying. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The air around them seemed to thicken, and the very space they occupied seemed to warp under its influence. The crew froze, paralyzed by the sheer enormity of the thing before them. Rios could feel it in his chest, a crushing weight of fear that threatened to suffocate him. The darkness wasn't just around them, it was inside of them, clawing at their minds. He could hear whispers again, the same voices they had heard before, but this time, they were different. They were louder, more insistent, and they were calling each of them by name, reminding them of their deepest fears. Leave this place." The whispers echoed. "You cannot stop what is already in motion." But Rios stood firm. He would not let the entity break them now. They had come this far. They had to destroy it. "We're not leaving," Rios said, his voice defiant. "Not without a fight." He raised his hand to signal the crew, and they slowly began to move toward the entity, weapons drawn, ready to confront the unimaginable. They could feel the entity's eyes on them, or at least, they felt as though it was watching them, though it had no visible face. It was like a presence, a consciousness, one that seemed to exist beyond the physical realm. Helena took a step forward, her hand trembling as she adjusted the settings on a device she had been working on, a makeshift EMP weapon. "We might be able to disrupt its control over the station," she said, her voice tight. "But we have to get close enough. And we don't know what it will do to us once we do." As they moved closer, the air grew colder still, and the entity seemed to react. The shadows in the room began to twist and pulse, and the walls of the core began to writhe. It was as if the very fabric of reality was breaking down under the entity's influence. The crew pressed on, their faces pale, their breath coming in quick gasps as they made their way toward the center of the room. The closer they got, the more the shadows seemed to reach out toward them, as if the darkness itself wanted to drag them into its depths. Suddenly, the ground trembled. The station's walls shook, sending a wave of panic through the crew. A loud screeching sound echoed through the core, followed by a sudden silence that was almost deafening. The entity seemed to grow even larger, its form expanding, enveloping the room in a suffocating shroud. It was no longer just a presence, it was a force, an all-consuming void that was swallowing everything in its path. "We need to act now," Rios shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the darkness. He turned to face the crew, his eyes filled with determination. "Helena, now!" Helena raised the EMP device, her hands shaking as she activated it. There was a brief, flickering moment when the shadows seemed to pause, as if the very fabric of reality had faltered. And then, a deafening pulse of energy erupted from the device, sending a shockwave through the core. The shadows recoiled, and the entity let out a high-pitched, almost human scream. The room shook violently as the core systems went haywire, sparks flying from the conduits, the lights flickering and buzzing. But the entity was not defeated. It writhed and shrieked, its form twisting in agony, but it refused to die. The pulse had disrupted its control, but it had not destroyed it. The entity was not of this world, it was something far older, far more powerful than they could ever have imagined. "Run!" Rios yelled, grabbing Helena by the arm. The core was collapsing, the walls crumbling under the force of the entity's rage. They had only one chance to escape. With the entity closing in, the crew sprinted toward the exit, their hearts racing as the station's core fell apart around them. But even as they fled, they knew one thing for certain: the fight was far from over. The entity would not be so easily vanquished. And it was only a matter of time before it came for them again. The station's tremors reverberated through their bodies as Rios and his team sprinted down the hallways of the Orion-X, their hearts pounding in their chests, the darkness still chasing them. The walls groaned and twisted, as though the station itself was alive, trying to trap them inside. Every step they took felt like a battle against the very fabric of the universe itself. Behind them, the core structure continued to break apart, the walls cracking and crumbling under the entity's fury. Sparks flew from the exposed conduits, the light flickering with each explosion, casting erratic shadows that seemed to stalk them. The whispers were back, louder now, filling the space with maddening sounds. Rios could hear his name being called again, the voices slipping through his thoughts like poison. He couldn't let them break him. Not now. Not when they were so close to freedom. "Move!" Rios shouted, his voice sharp and urgent as he grabbed Helena's arm and pulled her forward. The others followed, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror, each of them haunted by the relentless force pursuing them. It was clear now, there was no escaping the entity. It was not something that could be outrun or reasoned with. It was a force of nature, an ancient evil that had been awakened and was now consuming everything in its path. "We're not going to make it," Marco gasped, his breath coming in short bursts. "We can't outrun it forever. We don't have a choice." Rios barked back. His voice was cold, hard. They had no choice but to keep moving. "We have to reach the escape pods. It's our only chance." They turned another corner, making their way toward the docking bay. It felt like an eternity, the distance stretching out impossibly, but there was no time to waste. The door to the docking bay loomed ahead, but as they reached it, the door slammed shut with a violent clang, trapping them inside. "No!" Daniel shouted, slamming his hands against the control panel in frustration. "It's locked. We're trapped." Rios's mind raced. He could hear the entity drawing closer, feel its presence growing stronger. The walls were closing in, both literally and figuratively. If they didn't act fast, they would never leave this cursed station alive. Then, the impossible happened. A low, guttural growl filled the air. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to warp and twist into a solid form, a figure emerging from the darkness. It was the entity, its shape shifting and distorting, its form rippling like black water. It reached toward them, an unyielding, unstoppable force. Rios stood between the entity and the others, his body tense. "Get to the escape pods. Now," he yelled. The others hesitated for a moment, frozen by the overwhelming presence of the entity, but then they broke into motion. One by one, they sprinted toward the escape pods, desperate to survive, to get away from the nightmare that was unfolding. Rios watched them go, his mind spinning, but he couldn't afford to think about himself. Not now. He had one final decision to make. He reached into his suit, his fingers trembling as he activated the emergency override for the station's self-destruct sequence. It was a long shot, but it was the only way to ensure the entity didn't escape. It was the only way to stop it from reaching the galaxy outside. As he input the final command, a loud beep sounded, signaling that the countdown had begun. Rios didn't hesitate. He turned and ran toward the nearest escape pod. But as he did, he felt the darkness closing in on him, this time, not just physically, but mentally. The shadows clung to his skin, his thoughts clouded with the entity's whispers. He was almost there. But then, he stopped. The entity loomed behind him, its form becoming solid, its shape ever-changing, its presence suffocating. Rios could feel it pulling at his mind, dragging his thoughts into the abyss. He could hear the voices now, all of them, calling his name, mocking him. His own fears and doubts bubbled to the surface, but he refused to give in. The escape pod door opened in front of him, but Rios knew, deep down, that even if he made it out, the entity would follow. It was a part of the Orion-X now, a part of the universe itself. With a final, desperate breath, Rios turned toward the entity and yelled, "You will never leave this place." The entity shrieked, its form rippling and collapsing, as if it was writhing in agony. But just as quickly, it began to reform, stronger, more terrifying than ever. Rios made his choice. He stepped into the escape pod, slamming the door shut behind him. The countdown was still ticking, and as the pod blasted off into space, he could see the Orion-X disappearing into the distance. The station was still alive, still pulsing with the dark energy that the entity had injected into it. And Rios knew, as he drifted into the void, that it wasn't over. The entity would return, stronger than before. He closed his eyes, the weight of the universe pressing down on him. There was no escape. The eclipse was infinite. The escape pod was a small sanctuary amid the endless expanse of space, yet it offered no solace to Rios. As he floated through the dark void, the weight of what had just transpired hung heavily on him. The pod's cramped interior was silent except for the faint hum of its systems. He sat in the pilot's seat, staring out into the infinite black, watching as the Orion-X, the cursed station, faded into nothingness. The feeling of isolation was suffocating, and the realization that the entity was still out there, lurking, gnawed at his mind. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body trembling from the adrenaline crash. There was no celebration, no relief. Only the cold emptiness of space, stretching endlessly before him. Rios pressed his palm against the viewport, feeling the cold metal against his skin. The vastness of space seemed to mock him, reminding him that despite everything, he had escaped, yet not truly. The entity had not been defeated. It had only been delayed. It was still there, in the shadows, waiting, watching. He could feel it in his bones, its presence lingering like a nightmare that never truly ended. The pod's display flickered, and Rios instinctively glanced at the monitor. A message blinked in red, an incoming transmission. His pulse quickened. Who could be sending a transmission this far from the Orion-X? The beacon signal was still active, broadcasting a distress signal from the station. There was no way anyone else could be alive on board, not after everything that had happened. He hesitated for only a moment before accepting the transmission. A distorted voice crackled through the speakers. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder as the seconds ticked by. Rios. You think you escaped? We never left. The voice was a mixture of the crew's voices, layered together, distorted, and warped by the entity. Each word carried the weight of their fear, their desperation. The whispers he had heard aboard the Orion-X were nothing compared to this. It was as though the voices of his fallen comrades were trying to reach him from beyond the grave, trapped within the entity's grasp. Rios, we're still here, still waiting. The transmission was interrupted by a sharp, screeching noise, like nails dragging across metal. Rios clenched his jaw, unwilling to show weakness, but the unease crawled through his veins. His hands were cold, trembling as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The signal was coming from deep space, but it was clear that it was being manipulated, projected by the entity itself. The transmission ended abruptly, the screen going dark. Rios felt his heart hammer in his chest, his thoughts racing. How was it possible? The Orion-X was supposed to be destroyed, but it was still alive in some form, still reaching out to him. The entity had a far-reaching influence, its tendrils reaching beyond the station. It was in the transmissions, in the space between the stars, in the air he breathed. It was everywhere. His thoughts turned to the crew, to his friends, to the people he had failed to protect. They had given everything to try and stop the entity, but in the end, they were consumed. What if they hadn't truly died? What if the entity had trapped them in its shadow, twisted and warped their souls into something unrecognizable? Were they still out there, lost in the dark? A cold chill ran through Rios as he realized the terrifying truth. The entity wasn't just a force that lived in space, it was a parasite. It fed on fear, on the very essence of life itself, and it would not stop until everything in its reach was claimed. His hands gripped the controls of the pod, his knuckles turning white. He had failed. There was no victory here, no sense of escape. The universe was too vast, too full of darkness, and the entity was an endless void that could never be outrun. Suddenly, the pod systems beeped, indicating an incoming gravitational pull. Rios blinked in confusion. There was no planet or star in range to explain the sudden shift in trajectory. The pod was being pulled towards something. He quickly checked the navigation system, but it was malfunctioning. Nothing on the map made sense. "Not again," Rios whispered, dread sinking into his gut. The pull was growing stronger, and the pod's thrusters barely responded, struggling to break free. His body slammed back against the seat as the force of the gravitational pull intensified. The lights flickered in the cabin, casting long, eerie shadows. His heart pounded as he realized the truth. The entity was still out there, and it was calling him back. The display flickered again, showing a warped image of the Orion-X, as though the station was alive once more. It hovered in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of space, the shadow of the eclipse still hanging over it. The station was not gone, it was waiting, suspended in time, caught between the edges of the universe and something far worse. "Rios, come back, the cycle isn't finished," the distorted voice called out again, louder, more urgent. Rios closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the universe crashing down on him. The echoes of his fallen crew, the whispers of the entity, the cold touch of its shadow, it was all around him. He was caught in its grip, trapped in an endless cycle of fear and darkness. There would be no escape, no safe haven. With a final, breathless sigh, Rios braced himself as the pod was pulled into the gravitational field, the force of the entity's power overwhelming him. The universe around him darkened, the stars disappearing as he was drawn into the endless void. And in that moment, Rios understood, the eclipse was infinite. And so was the entity.